Right, everyone. Welcome to the Ad. Podcast. I'm happy to have with me today Asanka Abhisingha, and he's the CTO of the company WSO2. I'll let him tell you more about the intrigue of the company name. It shows their long history. And he is, the CTO there. I think recently appointed CTO and has been with the company for a long time, so he knows the history. And so welcome to the podcast, Asanka.
Thanks, Vaughn, and thanks for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be in your podcast. Yeah, I'll give a quick background about me as well. So I'm coming from application architecture and application development background, and started my career as a COBOL programmer, then moved to C++, Java, like that when the evolution of technologies happened, and mainly focused on distributed computing for last 20 plus years. So I've been with WSO2 for more than 15 years now. So WSO2 name coming from oxygenating web services. Because we started the company when web services were dominating, SOAP and various type of web services standards. And the founders coming from that background as well, Sanjeev and Paul, they contributed to many web services specifications, as well as we implemented foundation for web services by contributing to Apache Foundation. So that is how the company started. And from day one, we are following open source standards and contributing to open source. So that is our DNA inside the organization. So that is how everything started. But what we did basically looked at what's really happening in the technology, as well as what's really happening in the enterprises, and augment the products fitting to the technology, as well as something that is very useful for these organizations, and change the product architecture and the delivery of the product accordingly.
So what's it like to be CTO now? You were before sort of like chief evangelist, developer evangelist, and platform evangelist, and now CTO. Can you tell us the difference between your role?
Yeah, so before I took the chief evangelist role, I was the deputy CTO, as well as I was lucky to work really close with two great CTOs. Paul Fremantle was the first CTO, and then I had a chance to work with Eric Newcomer. Got a lot of insights from them, as well as from the WSO2 customer portfolio. I closely work with many CTOs, as well as technologists like you in the industry. So gathered a lot of information and then insight during my 20 years of experience. And it was a gradual move, I would say, not an overnight role change. So I think the environment prepared for me to take this new role, as well as still I'm getting a lot of support from the system as well. So it's challenging because we are a sizable company, and then a lot of responsibilities. And I'm currently mainly focusing on the external architecture of WSO2 and helping customers a lot, as well as bringing customer feedback into the product teams, as well as still the evangelist role is still remains, because I tell the WSO2 story, as well as working as a spokesperson by speaking at many events, as well as regularly updating the industry analysts.
Nice. Thanks for explaining your past and current role. Seems like natural steps, so that's good. So WSO2 is currently leading in their business, your business, with two pretty significant, even maybe a little bit revolutionary takes on things. Like, okay, you have your own programming language now, which I don't know if this is really true, but I saw some years ago that someone said that it costs like $1 billion to bring a new language into the market, which, whoa, $1 billion, that's some deep commitment. And then your Choreo platform is quite interesting. It's not just cloud, it's cloud with some very, I guess, opinionated, approaches to software development, which is good. And I've talked with Sanji and others there with you about it. And I know that you have this sort of mindset about how things should be done. And that's good, because I think people need that kind of leadership, to really help them zero in on, okay, here's an opinionated way to do this. If you follow this way, we know that it works and we can help you make it work and you're going to be good, right? So I would say that's sort of like the overall message for, at least from an outsider looking in. Is that sort of what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think you framed it nicely. So yes, we took some risk and challenges as well when introducing the programming language as well as the Choreo platform. Reason for that, we operate based on first principles, and we identify the first principles based on what exactly the industry looking for, and then how we can introduce something useful for the industry, because our motivation coming from the day one as a middleware company to simplify this creation of various distributed computing components. And now we tell it as how you can easily create digital experiences, because end of the day, every organization is building some kind of digital experience internally or externally. So as a technology provider, that's our responsibility, how we can simplify it. How we simplify it basically by creating great abstractions. So that's where all these things came into the picture. And I first touch based on the Ballerina language and then come to Choreo. So Ballerina, we started in 2014. Basically, what we identified, the configuration-driven integration is working at that time, but then again, it has limitations. So how we can find a way to overcome that particular hurdle? Because a lot of customers and users were using our integration technologies, and we did many experiments and identified the best way to solve this problem by introducing a language. So that's where Ballerina came into the picture. At the same time, by coming from this web services roots, we identified it is not easy to do network programming, because there's a lot of things underneath. You need to know about HTTP, and then you need to know about how the network works. And then there are a lot of quality of services around that, like security governance associated with these programs that you write. So how we can simplify it for the programmer, and then let the developer to focus on the business problem rather than going to these underneath technical complexity that they had to face when they are developing a language. So that was the motivation when we introduced Ballerina language. As you said, yes, it's a big investment. We have more than 100 people full-time working on development side, and many other roles in developer relations and various other activities associated with the language. So it's a investment, but we are seeing a lot of success with the investment we have done, because even Ballerina listed as the 22nd language in a language listing. Even getting to a language listing is not easy, but getting that position is a great achievement that we see. So that is the background and how Ballerina came into the picture. I think the same semantics apply for Choreo as well. So we were helping organizations to build platforms. Like large organizations invest a lot, put around 300, 400 development teams, and start building these platforms to simplify the stuff internally as well as increase the productivity. But this is a never-ending task for these organizations, and they were not focusing on how they can deliver applications or value for the business. And this was a problem we identified. So what we thought, rather than letting each and every enterprise to build these platforms, why don't we provide an opinionated platform that they can build their business abstractions, so business applications on top of that. So that is how Choreo came into the picture. And yes, it's an opinionated platform because we want to give the best practices as well as some of the productivity enhancements within the platform. That's why we make it in such way so an organization can get into the platform and then quickly build applications. And our tagline for that is just add developers. So what we are telling, just add developers and we will take care of the rest of the problems and the complexity that you will see in a platform.
Yeah, I think that that's a very good way to develop a major business strategy or a few different strategic initiatives, because it came about organically, right? It's not like Sanji and a few people went away on a retreat for a weekend and came back and said, we know what we need. We need a new language and we need a platform and everybody's going to love it, right?
Exactly.
So the needs of customers, of clients drove this, and it wasn't small time players, but 300 teams. That's, I don't know what size the teams are, but even if it's 5 people, to 10 people, that's pretty significant. So yeah, very respectable way to go about this. Now, I'd like to rewind a little bit because, okay, we have this introduction to Ballerina language and Choreo, the platform, but let's talk about architecture for a moment. You've done a lot of work in architecture, and I think that your ideas around cell-based architecture are quite interesting. So let me just ask this. Can you provide a basic introduction to cell-based architecture and explain how it differs from other architectures like maybe ports and adapters, hexagonal?
Yeah. So again, I introduced it with the same first principles because we identified there's a gap in the industry and as a solution introduced the cell-based architecture. So it has a lot of parallels to some of these existing architecture styles, and I would say it is enhancing some of the architecture styles like event-based architecture as well as a microservice architecture. So difference basically about the cell-based architecture, how you can group these workloads, or I call it as a component. The atomic unit inside the cell-based architecture is a component. How you can group it and then give some flexibility on grouping as well. Like organizations can pick different type of methodologies to define the cell boundary, as well as another unique aspect of cell-based architecture is the cell gateway. So the concept also came with the system biology and how a membrane works in a biological cell. The same concept I brought into the cell-based architecture. Like a membrane is controlling a biological cell, the cell gateway controls the entire communication of the components inside the cell, as well as the communication in between cells as well. So it's basically a inter and intra-cell communication controlled by this gateway. So that way, the organization can build a proper secured communication layer by defining northbound, southbound, eastbound, westbound type of communications as well as secure them. Another thing that I identified as well as intentionally put in the architecture, a way to connect design, development and deployment. Because that is one problem that I identified. The designer or the architect will architect something and developer will develop something slightly different, and DevOps will go and deploy something completely different. So there's no connection there. So how we can fix that problem is one thing that I wanted to address when defining the cell-based architecture. In this architecture style, the cell is that particular unit that you design, and then cell is the unit that you develop, as well as cell is the unit that you deploy. So that way there's no surprises when it comes to the production system versus what we put in the blueprint. So that is another unique aspect that I can highlight in the cell-based architecture. Another thing is how it aligns with the organization structure. Because another issue I identified in large enterprises, the concept of two pizza teams were there, but there was no proper way to define the two pizza teams, as well as how you can give architecture boundary, as well as how we can give development boundary and deployment boundary for these two pizza teams. And cells providing that aspect as well, so organizations can easily fit in their organization structure, or the development team structure into the architecture by using cell-based architecture.
So when did you when did you kind of recognize this cell-based architecture as a pattern? When did you sort of, frame in your mind that this is what you'd like to do?
Yeah, the idea came around 2016, 2017 timeframe by looking at various things enterprises were doing. Initially, I called it as a segmented architecture because what I saw inside the enterprises, some of the development teams, they are creating segments inside the central deployment infrastructure and then trying to take control out of it. So that was the motivation came. And then I looked at how we can map it to architecture concept. At the same time, Uber released this Death Star architecture diagram, and that was another motivation for me. Like we can't have this type of ungoverned and very messy architecture inside an enterprise. So how we can find a solution? So I started working on this for around 2 years. And Paul Fremantle, who was the CTO at that time, worked with me on this paper. And in 2018 summer, I released the 0.7 version of the architecture paper. That was the first public preview. I released it under Creative Commons, and then got a lot of feedback since I released it under Creative Commons. I got pull requests from various industry leads as well, because I put it as put it on Markdown and then make it as a inside Git. So got a lot of feedback, and then in 2019 fall, I released the 1.0 version of the architecture paper.
Interesting. The reason I ask is when I think about prior art, I've seen people or heard people refer to cell-based architecture as what Uber refers to now as DOMA. Yes. And it's interesting that you bring up the Uber Death Star architecture. This is the first time I've heard about that. Can you explain what that is so that we could even see, it sounds like they could have been influenced by your paper to move out of that. So can you tell us about the Death Star?
Yes. Yeah, so the Death Star architecture, basically what happened when microservices came as a mainstream way of development, people didn't look at it from the architecture point of view. They started dividing this the logic into small components and start writing these microservices across the organization. And then it started having 100 of microservices, 1,000 of microservices into many inside the organization, and connected with each other. And nobody knew what is the dependency between each and every microservice, as well as who's the owner of a microservice. And it created a huge mess inside the organization. That's where the Death Star architecture came. It's really hard to identify where the communication flows are going and how you can fix a problem because the dependencies were too much. So that's the story about the Death Star architecture. And the DOMA, or domain-oriented microservice architecture, came 3-4 years after I introduced the cell-based architecture, as well as the person who led that team is a good friend of mine as well.
Very interesting. Yeah, very, very cool. So, yeah, Cell-based architecture / DOMA is, yes, you have microservices, but there are layers of sort of categories of microservices, right? So you have the business kind of services sort of up top, if you will, like if you think in layers of services, independent services, not layers within a single service. Layers of services, you've got the businessy things here, and then the sort of coordinated things that those are using under it, and then kind of leaping to the bottom, because who knows how many layers you might need. But going to the bottom, you now have technical microservices that are taking care of things like security, persistence, and so forth, right?
Exactly. And I think when microservices came into the picture and people started writing microservices, this inner architecture and out architecture. I think today we call it as the control plane and the data plane. So those things were not there. So people just started writing the inner architecture or the data plane stuff without focusing on the control plane. I think now it has gone to a great extent and improved a lot. So we see organizations are properly using it. And those are some of the foundational principles we apply for our Choreo platform as well, how you can have a proper data plane and a control plane, and then manage this environment for people to just come and write services, and the platform manage all the other quality of services and dependencies.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to just name two companies that the Death Star architecture, or what I would actually call the distributed big ball of mud. That's the idea. Everything is connected to everything else. You don't really know where the dependencies are. And essentially, you have to leave everything running. If you unplug a service, you don't know what you're going to crash, right? You literally say, okay, we are committed to running this service for the lifetime of the platform, whether it's being used still or not, or just occasionally, or we don't know, right? It reminds me a bit of at least the early Netflix. And then also some years later, I saw this Monzo bank in Europe, and maybe you've seen that article or blog post where they have it actually looks like the Death Star. It's a circle with 1,600 microservices, all like interconnected, and it is to me personally, it's frightening looking. It's like how can anybody reason about this? And yeah, I don't know. So is that sort of what you're
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that is what I saw, as well as one thing we need to understand: every company is not Netflix or every company is not Uber, because sometimes enterprises are just trying to copy what they are doing, but their problems are very specific for their domain, as well as they have enough technical people to manage and run these type of systems. So that's where the simplicity and how we have to pick the correct architecture as well as implementation is very important for the enterprises, because end of the day, whatever we are doing at the technical level required to translate into value into the business. So that's where we think that we have to carefully look at what these organizations are doing, get the best practices, no issue, but then again, don't copy exactly what they are doing, because it will lead into a lot of complexity. And that's why we see recent changes of CIOs in many organizations, because end of the day, it's just technology, not the business value delivered by these teams.
Right. And of course, that's where, my constant signal is the business matters, and all technology should support the business. Purposeful architecture, right? So, yeah, does everybody need cell-based architecture? It sounds like the companies that you're working with can benefit from it. They may not have as many layers of these, individual service types as Uber or Netflix or whoever, but I should say Uber, because I don't know what Netflix is doing now, but with DOMA, but you can still benefit from it. And I think this is where you like to think in terms of domain-driven design. How is cell-based architecture used with domain-driven design, or does it domain-driven design with cell-based architecture, and how do they sort of help or complement each other?
Yeah, so I'll connect the dots, and there's a connection between how I get to know about you as well with this story. So when I designed the cell-based architecture, I didn't directly map it to domain-driven design because I read the big blue book of domain-driven design some time back, and I didn't like it because the things have changed, and then it is more about object orientation. So I left it, the concept, for a while. Then at one of the events, I believe Nordic APIs, I did the cell-based architecture presentation. And then one of the guys from a university who was running an IT division in a university came to me, walked to me and said, "Great presentation, great concept, nice architecture style. This directly map into domain-driven design. Did you look at it?" I said, "No, I tried, but I didn't like the concepts." Then he said, "You should go and read Vaughn's book," and then recommended your domain-driven design book. And then I immediately got my Kindle and then bought your book and start reading it. And it gave me a different perspective of domain-driven design fit into where we are today, and then how we can apply it to current design issues that we have. Then I was thinking how this is relevant, because one question came to me from a lot of people: how I can define the cell boundary. Then this was kind of a very lightning thing for me, because a domain or a subdomain can easily map into the cell. So that is how the connection worked between domain-driven design and the cell-based architecture. And now the most of the organizations using the cell-based architecture, they define the cell boundaries using domain-driven design, and either it's a subdomain or a domain. And I recommend everybody to read your book as the foundation to get the idea.
Wow, thank you. Actually, I think maybe you told me a little bit, but this is sort of the first time I heard the whole story of that. And I've always enjoyed, since I think we met, maybe it was 3 years ago, or
it's around 3 years.
Yeah, maybe right when COVID was relatively new. I think we met online, and I've always enjoyed, our discussions. So I'm glad the book helped, and thank you for recommending it to others. So where do you see the overlap between the two then, DDD and cell-based architecture? Where is DDD mostly applied in cell-based, and where maybe even where it's not so applicable?
I think it's basically, I would say, apply a lot, because that gives the organization to find a way to define the cell, the foundation to find the cells, as well as using the bounded context. You can define what type of communication that you should allow in the cell gateway. So it's a nice way of getting into the cell-based architecture, as well as how you define the cells as well. And then one thing I saw, as well as I identified from your content as well, when the organization looked at the way the communication happens, I think this is defined in the Conway law as well. If they map the organization communication into the this application structure and define domains, that is very effective. That is something I found when people are doing effective domain-driven design. And when you translate that into cell-based architecture, it even takes to the next level. Now you have the correct granularity, and then you can define the microservices properly. And most importantly, you can give the responsibility to maintain these microservices inside cells to the relevant groups who will enhance their knowledge on that particular domain and start providing the capabilities to the organization. Then the reusability will go high and the productivity will go high, and they will keep on looking at how I can improve that capabilities that I am providing from that particular domain, and start building this concept of a modular enterprise, or some call it as a composable enterprise. So the end goal is that there's no end game, but I think the North Star is that how we can get into that level of composability inside the organization. So I would say these two concepts are helping each other a lot, and then they are aligning. And I'm keeping an eye on what's really happening in the domain-driven design side as well, and keep on improving the architecture style fit into that.
Nice. So would you say then that, roughly speaking, a bounded context maps to a cell? Is that the general idea?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
So then it's not a tiny thing. Like, a cell is not necessarily a tiny thing. So it's not like you're deploying an entity in a cell. You could, I guess, if there was some specific advantage to that, but that's not the goal. It's more like a relatively fine-grained business capability. Not that's even, if you think about saying, like, here's an example I have on my mind because I'm working in this, but you have white label insurance, right? So if you take the capability of white label insurance, so this is an insurance company that wants to white label. It's basically a way to provide insurance, but to their agents, and the agents look as if they are, the actual insurance company, or that they have their own insurance company. And so any of their customers, to them, it's like, okay, they're more than an agent maybe, or something, but they're an agent. Now, you take white label insurance, that's pretty coarse grained, right? I mean, that's like, well, what does that actually mean? But then if you decompose that into actual sort of functional business capabilities, like the actual things that have to make that up, and not talking about process, but just so you would have like underwriting, you would have risk assessment and generating a premium for the risk, and then something to manage policies, something to manage claims. And so maybe it could be like that underwriting is a cell, and
exactly,
rating is a cell. Okay.
Exactly. I think you took a nice analogy, and exactly that is the way. And then it took my mind to a couple of designs some of the companies working at the moment, the same way that define these cells and then cell boundaries. I think there are a bunch of things. One is like getting these domains and subdomains correctly, as well as another aspect on the API first approach, because when you look at the type of APIs, it gives another hint for the organization on defining these cell boundaries and what type of capabilities that they should expose from each and every cell, internally or externally, as capabilities.
Can you give some examples of companies that have used cell-based architecture and DDD and succeeded with it? Because I think sometimes you look around, it's hard to find examples of it. When you ask me, I can very rarely talk about companies that I work with or have worked with, because it's all NDA. I literally cannot say their name, as having worked with them. But you seem to be maybe more open to that. So why don't you tell us more about it?
Yeah, I think I have the same problem, because some of these names cannot tell in public, and I don't have the list that I can tell that I have the PR clearance.
Yeah, it's safer to not say any names at all. But okay, so maybe industries and hints around that.
Yes, so that's a good one. Yeah, so I think again, many industries like healthcare is one major industry that using the architecture style when they define some of these APIs, as well as applications that they develop for their members. And this came very mainstream during pandemic as well, because digital was the only way they could connect with the members, and we helped bunch of large healthcare providers to do that, as well as financial industries utilizing it a lot as well, especially when it comes to automation, as well as how you can build digital experiences for end users. Cell-based architecture is utilized. And telco, energy, those are two other sectors. Again, a lot of digitization happening inside these enterprises, and they are getting the benefit of cell-based architecture to expedite the transformation, as well as how they can have a clean architecture, and how they can divide their teams into two pizza teams. So those are a bunch of examples from the industry.
Okay, so we've gone into cell-based architecture. I think people have a means to have a pretty good background on it. If they want to know more, could you point them to the paper? Just search for Asanka cell-based architecture, and it's online.
Exactly. They will find the markdown document in the Git repo, and then feel free to give feedback and then improvements, criticize. So I'm happy to take the feedback and improve the architecture paper.
Okay, so now let's transition to programming language. I would say that JavaScript, TypeScript, maybe Python are sort of like used heavily in the cloud. And I would say Java, obviously Java and C#, but we have some, VM warm-up considerations with those, like depending on how your architecture actually runs in deployment, it could be expensive to start up like a Java VM, right? If it's not running hot constantly, which then costs money, right? So there's all these trade-offs. So JavaScript and TypeScript, let's say, work well in that environment because there is no warm-up. But now you see this, you're working with clients who are using, let's focus just on those two languages. What do you see going on in cloud with those languages that Ballerina just is going to solve a specific set of problems that people have that they face with cloud?
Yeah, I think now when you take a language, the purpose, what they are doing from that language can be different. So Ballerina coming and playing a role, especially when they are building applications, like end-to-end applications starting from the data layer into the UI. So when somebody building that kind of cloud-native applications, that's where the Ballerina language giving an advantage on top of these other languages that you explained earlier. So I will give you a couple of examples. Now, when we are doing modern application development in a cloud-native environment, data types are key. That we are dealing with JSON, we are dealing with data coming from various databases that we call as record sets, and then XML is still used in somewhat, because you can't just ignore the applications we developed during last 2 decades. So those type of data structures are first level citizens, so data types in the language. So the programmers, they don't have to import libraries, they don't have to do marshalling, unmarshalling of these type of data sets. So it's inbuilt within the language, so that is an advantage that they get from the data point of view. And then we have tooling embedded with that, like data mappers, how easily they can map these data sets into different type of formats. And then another thing, like if somebody wants to write a service, they have to do a lot of stuff, like they have to do HTTP binding and then identify the libraries related to that, secure them. All these things takes time, as well as once you have many libraries within that particular runtime, it becomes a really bulky runtime. And then there are two ways, like you bind it and then the container will get really heavy, or you add sidecars and then it will become many sidecars around the container. But if those capabilities are built in within the language, then you can get the full benefit of a cloud native infrastructure, as well as you can eliminate the dependencies and make it completely immutable when these capabilities are within the language. So one thing I told some time back is middleware is disappearing into code and infrastructure. Because today you can't afford the way that you used middleware earlier. Earlier days, we deploy the stuff into a server runtime, and it works perfectly fine. But in the today cloud native environment, you can't do that. So that's where I said the middleware is disappearing into a code and infrastructure. Infrastructure part is very clear. I think Kubernetes is leading there and it won the war. And we are getting a lot of benefit from Kubernetes and Kubernetes services. And it covers up to a great extent of middleware capabilities that we got early. The rest is where the code coming into the picture. And that's where we embedded most of these middleware capabilities into the language. Now they can just write code and get the benefit out of the language itself and the native capabilities provided within the language to be productive, as well as easily develop these network programs without worrying too much.
I remember I did have this conversation with you and Sanji at one point, and I was talking about the importance of well-defined schemas for exchanging data, exchanging information across cells, let's say, and even the need for a schema registry. And I recall him saying, you don't need that. And I sort of, I was like, well, I don't know. And he said, well, it slows people down. If you're using Ballerina, it takes care of that for you. So it understands natively JSON, let's say. Let's just stick with JSON. So can you tell us more about, okay, what does the language do with JSON that makes it sort of unnecessary to worry about schema versions, right? Like, okay, this is the definition of this at any given time and the version that I depend on. How are you protected from those kinds of things with Ballerina?
Yeah, I think it is similar to the way we handle the COBOL copybook records. Like you define the schemas there and then use it inside the program. Same way Ballerina type system works, that you can define these different type of schemas as types and then use it inside the program. And then the versioning of that particular service is the way that you define different type of schemas, and that translate into the API provided from the service as well. So that API version and the service version is basically the way that you identify different type of schemas and schema changes. That is how the language is designed and implemented.
Okay, so then what about, so that sounds to me like web service calls web service, right? That's sort of a natural way of thinking. And I submit with my HTTP request a JSON object. How does it work when you're publishing domain events, for example? You publish events outside your cell and someone is going to consume those. How does it work then? Because I'm assuming they're now dependent on a schema version that they don't necessarily, I guess they could define it, but which version are they consuming, right? How is that solved?
I think that is solved by using the developer portal, because everything get listed in the developer portal and then all these schemas are listed there. So they see different type of event sources and different type of APIs in the developer portal, so they can get that information from that. So the language, basically the program or the service that you write, get listed in the developer portal, and that becomes the way how developers communicate as well as identify these different type of schema types.
I see. So it is sort of in a way a schema registry, but maybe not as explicitly schema registry, but it's more like, I guess, a discovery mechanism.
Yes.
And then in Ballerina, let's say I'm a consumer of domain events. I go to this, you called it...
a developer portal.
I go to the developer portal. I discover, the availability of this service and this kind of event that is published. And I can then say, okay, give me the Ballerina definition for that version of the event.
Yes. So that's how it works, because that... sharing and intercommunication in between different type of cells happen through that, and we treat it always as an API. It can be a request response or it can be a event-based API, but that's how the communication happens. Within the cell, it's a service-to-service calls, and it's a single team, so they can use the same concept, but that visibility of those service endpoints are within the team, not outside the team. The people outside will see only the APIs that expose through the cell gateway, and that get published in the developer portal.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess it is a little safer than I first understood from that conversation whatever it was, 1.5 years ago or something like that. So I feel better now. Thank you for explaining. Okay, now let's talk just a little further about the language in terms of, I guess, is it a dynamic type language or is it statically typed? And I think it's a functional programming language.
Yeah.
So there is no mutability in the language.
Exactly. So it's a functional language, and then it's not the dynamic types one. It's like tightly coupled or static bindings are there in the types, and if they have to change it, you have to recompile it, and with containers and then container orchestration systems, we don't see it as a big issue because you can redeploy something with a newer version without breaking the capabilities that you got from the earlier version of the program that you wrote.
Interesting. Yeah, pretty amazing. It really does have a lot of cloud thinking, service thinking, built into it. And what do you hear about the pleasure of using the language? Like when people write Ballerina, are they like, whoa, this is really elegant, it feels nice? Or, I think you're going to say positive things, but, realistically, do people really love the language? Or is it sort of like, well, it does a lot of good things, but I wish it were differently expressed or something?
Yeah, I think the people who's using the language, they love it. And personally, I love it as a developer because I do a lot of coding using Ballerina language. I think the entry point is the issue because languages are like religions for developers. So how you can get somebody to start a new language is a little tricky at some points. But fortunately, the Copilot came into the picture. And with Copilot, it is helping developers to learn a new language as well as be really productive. So since we have capabilities or tooling for VS Code, we see that adoption is getting increased and people are getting really productive with writing new languages. And another thing that I saw, people who's new to programming languages, they quickly get the concepts and then be productive. But if somebody who's done a lot of programming using the object-oriented programming and those traditional concepts, they find it little difficult to understand the new concept. As example, my son, now he's 15, but he started coding Ballerina when he was 12. Since it was a new thing for him, he was very productive within the language because he kind of got the concepts, and even he taught me some of the concept by telling, okay, this is an internal call, you should do this. And if it is an external call going out to the network, you should do it like that. So he got the concept nicely. Then I was looking at it from more object-oriented point of view. But to answer your question, actually, the feedback is really good. And we see a lot of community engagement with the language as well. So we have active Discord channel, and then we are doing a lot of community events as well. And the meetups are back, like physical meetups are back after pandemic now. So we are going into different type of communities through the meetups as well and evangelizing the language.
Yeah, that's good. I was at my first, I was at a public, in-person event back in November of 2022, but I just recently went to the Como camp in Vienna, in person. We about 100 people involved in that, and it went well. And I've transitioned I think I even forgot to put my mask on the flight back to the US. I flew over with a mask and maybe not on the way back. I don't remember, but it's, it's just sort of feeling like, well, maybe I'm not going to get sick. And so, or maybe I need to be more careful. I don't know. So, but it's a nice feeling. Well, let's transition then to Choreo. So more information about Choreo. Can you tell us just kind of first high level? Well, you already did a little bit, but more like what's the programming or the DevOps interface?
Yeah. So if you look at Choreo and take it as a full package, we position it as an internal developer platform. So that is the full capability that provided by Choreo. But if someone is looking for just SaaS API management, they can use it just for that. And if somebody is using for iPaaS or just for integrations, they can use Choreo for that. If somebody is using to just write microservices or cloud native application development, they can use it for that, as well as a DevOps platform as well. So those are kind of entry vectors that we would say for Choreo, because sometimes the requirement might be very specific. So the internal developer platform might be overkill for that particular organization. So they can use these entry vectors to enter to Choreo. But the ultimate or the main purpose of Choreo is to provide this complete internal developer platform that it starts from the design and take application to run basically, and then maintain and get the runtime observability and analytics, so on and so forth. So that like end-to-end application development supported in Choreo. And then fundamental things like multi-environment, inbuilt CI/CD. I call it as pipeline tuned because when you write the first code, it is connected with the pipeline. So it takes that code from development into production. And various other aspects like testing, code verification, all these things are inbuilt, as well as it's SaaS, but more than SaaS, because the control plane providing a SaaS experience, but you can connect your own PDP or your data plane, a private data plane to Choreo. As example, if you want to use GCP, AWS, or Microsoft Azure, you can pick the relevant cloud provider and connect your PDP. As well as it's providing a multi-cloud infrastructure as well. If you want to run multiple PDPs or private data planes, you can do that. As example, one of the healthcare providers that we are working with, they are using GCP to run data related products or APIs, and they are using AWS to run the compute related workloads. So they use both PDPs and have a single developer portal to list all the APIs that they develop. So that is one beauty of Choreo. As well as if the organization is running a private Kubernetes cluster on OpenShift or VMware Tanzu, they can connect that PDP into Choreo as well. So the current requirement is a Kubernetes cluster. As long as you are on Kubernetes, you can support it, and we are extending the capability to other serverless platforms, and you can just consume Lambdas and Azure functions, so on and so forth in the future. So it is basically framing it as an internal developer platform with the correct semantics, because current internal developer platform definition only covering the delivery part, that CI/CD side of the story. But we are adding application development on top of this delivery and making it a complete development platform, so organization can just focus on the application development and get the full benefit of the platform by consuming Choreo.
So that's very appealing, compelling platform, it sounds like. Now let's this is a completely random question. When you say that it is SaaS capable or sort of inviting SaaS development. Do you have subscription services built in? You have like payment services? Do you have multi-tenant somehow? Is that sort of built into the platform?
Yes, it's multi-tenanted, and then we have the concept of organization, sub-organizations within the platform to do that. And the hierarchy comes like you have organizations, sub-organizations, then there's a concept of a project that directly map into cells. And then you have components that you develop inside the particular project. So that is how the structure works. And we have multiple models that you can get into a pay-as-you-go model, and it directly connect with the payment platforms. Or if you are an enterprise, then we have customized enterprise packages that you can pick based on how you are planning to use Choreo, and based on that the billing works. So that's a complete SaaS experience that we get. And we see a lot of organizations, they start with the pay-as-you-go model and then transition to the enterprise model, as well as we have free tiers as well for the individual developers, as well as somebody who wants to try out, they can just sign up. And there's a limitation of number of components that you create. But then again, if it is a serious POC that they are working on, we have some flexibilities on that. As well as something we did introduce the startup package as well, because we see startups can benefit a lot using such platform, because they don't have to worry about platform engineering, DevOps too much. They can just get few developers and start building their idea inside Choreo. To encourage that, we introduce the startup package, and it's another very popular offering in the community.
Well, I am quite interested. I know we've talked about, okay, I need to use Choreo and Ballerina. It sounds like maybe we should get more serious about it. Now, there are a couple of SaaS problems in general. One is noisy neighbor, right? So in persistence. So you're sharing a database and even, a table or collection, and you're basically striping it with a tenant ID, and you have some tenant that's really using your service heavily, and you have another one who doesn't use it as heavily, and the neighbors get pounded in performance, throughput, latency, because of that one noisy or even a few noisy neighbors. How do you solve that problem?
Yeah, so that's where the concept of the cloud data plane and the private data plane coming on, because the cloud data plane, all this sharing happens among the tenants used in the cloud data plane. And if somebody is running a serious business, our recommendation is to use the private data plane. That way, everything relevant for that particular user goes to their private data plane, and it is not affected. And the tenant is basically the private data plane for that particular organization. So that is how we are solving that problem. And small to medium enterprises can use the the cloud data plane, the shared one. Again, they have a choice. Either they can pick AWS or Azure at the moment, and we will support GCP soon. But the private data plane is up to the organization. They can even use their own account and come and configure it with Choreo. So that is how we are solving that problem. And you nailed it correctly, because that's a common issue that we see in many SaaS solutions.
Yeah. Well, I said two. Obviously, there are more, but these are the ones that really kind of stand out. And the second one is not just security, but as multi-tenant. So you have the ability to manage organizations. Are there sub-organizations, and then, in other words, groups, and then users within groups and things like that?
Exactly. So that same concept, we have organization, sub-organization concept, as well as based on different type of RBAC or role-based access control, you can maintain different groupings. And then the project concept is there to separate workloads that directly map into cell architecture, as I explained. And then inside that, you develop the components. So the organization, they have the full control of the development environment and different type of environments like test environment, production environment, access, all these things can control. And another thing benefiting this with this remote work, because with remote work, organizations are looking for more governance, how they can provide a self-service but governed environment for the developers, and Choreo providing that as well. One key capability as well as the interest why organizations are using Choreo.
Well, an obvious question is, after this, developers are going to say, yeah, but what about vendor lock-in? And I have to say, if this suits you better than AWS or GCP or Azure or whatever, like if it suits you, what's the problem? Okay, there's always going to be this issue of vendor lock-in. And then one fear for people might be, yeah, well, is WSO2 going to last? And you are a unicorn now. You've gotten, what was it, more than 100 million funding recently. And it sounds like investors and people are pretty into this, and they're not going to just let WSO2 disappear.
Yeah. So to answer that question, Vaughn, there's no vendor lock-in at all. Because they can develop the components using Ballerina language or any other language. Okay, and we have this concept of a bring your own container. They can bring any container and run it inside Choreo as well. End of the day, it's just a Git repo. So you write your code, commit to the Git, and then Choreo will pick it. And if they want to go outside Choreo and deploy it, just take the code from the Git repo, and then they can go and deploy it in any place that they would like to run the code. So that is how the flexibility is there. And the bring your own container will improve the reusability of the existing work that they have done. And we are not envisioning everybody to rewrite everything using Ballerina. If you use Ballerina, you will get benefits and then added advantages of Choreo, but writing it from Node or any other Spring Boot or whatever that they prefer to do will provide the platform capabilities, and they can still stick to the languages that they are working on. So that is how we have made it as an open system. So they have the flexibility to go out from Choreo and they run the workloads at any point. So one thing you mentioned about the mega clouds, why don't they directly consume the mega clouds and why they use Choreo? Basically, even if you use a mega cloud, there's a significant amount of platform engineering you need to configure it to the correct level. And we are getting that burden out because this is a pre-configured environment that you don't have to worry about getting that configured, like getting all these firewalls and then different type of security controls. Basically, Choreo is providing a zero trust environment that you can start coding without worrying about this deep platform engineering activities.
Yeah, pretty amazing, actually. So it's sort of like the way I think of Choreo as being Netlify or Versal with a lot of bling, right? But I mean, like I know Netlify pretty well, and I have to say that they're a game changer, right? But I'm not very happy with their built-in security, identity and access management, let's say. But then you go over to AWS and you've got, okay, you do have bling over there, but you also have like not a great landing area to parachute in, right? So you're maybe landing on some jagged rocks or mountaintop, and you've got to find a way to get down to ground level without hurting yourself. And it just sounds to me like Choreo is you just take those ideas and merge them up into this, wow, I can't, someone pinch me. I can't believe this is actually available.
Exactly. So that's what we exactly did, like identify these gaps as well as problems these enterprises are facing. and then try to provide the solution because we had the foundation, because we had the API management capabilities, integration capabilities, and identity and access management capabilities from our software side. And we took those as the foundation, as well as we were doing managed cloud services for a long time for our customers, and took that experience from the DevOps point of view. And we acquired a company called Platformer 2 years back. So that gave us a really good foundation for Kubernetes, and we put all these things together and build the Choreo platform on top of that. So it's basically productizing our 15 plus years of experience by working with enterprises is what Choreo provided.
Yeah, this is very cool. I'm excited. I know now that I have to go try at minimum Choreo, but I think I have to put a little time into Ballerina. But I have to tell you a little secret that I can think of about 10 people who would tell me right now, no, you're not going to do that. Right now, you have to get other things done first. So, but I'm telling you this, I have to try it, because just the whole idea of getting rid of the SaaS problems that, exist, and what you really want to do is have a nice application for people to use, a nice, software as a service to use, and you don't want to go into all this subscription stuff and whatever. I think this is really smart. Like, why haven't other clouds provided this kind of thing? You guys are unique. That's at least one of your differentiating advantages, and congratulations. This is cool.
Thank you for the feedback, and we are looking forward to get more feedback from you once you try out Choreo, as well as write some cool programs from Ballerina.
Right on. Well, Asanka, thank you so much for joining in today. Is there anything else you'd like to... Oh, did I ask you about AI? I didn't ask you about AI. What's happening there? Just before we say goodbye, I guess an interview these days is incomplete without something said about AI.
I know that is the topic, and so I'd say I think it's kind of a sandstorm at the moment. We don't know where it is heading, but there's a lot of positive side that I see. Even as an individual, I am getting benefit of using AI as an assistant for me to do a lot of research work, as well as do some stuff that I spend a lot of time unnecessarily. So the productivity has increased. So I believe the same thing will happen for general public as well. How organizations will use AI and then increase the experience of the individuals by providing or taking the digital experience into the next level. And at the same time, there are regulations are coming and putting the relevant guardrails as well. That is good. So I think things are moving really fast. So overnight, a lot of changes are happening. And I think it's unbelievable, actually, some of these innovations are happening. And living in the Bay Area, what I identify, a lot of startups are coming up with a different type of AI ideas and fueling their industry. So it's an interesting time, but I think the foundation is needed, right? You need APIs, you need integrations to feed data into these language models. So still those basics are required, and some basics principles are coming back, like API monetization, because we were looking at internal API management for a long time, and external API management kind of was there, but not dominated too much. Some companies like Twilio, they did it great, but not everybody. But now it is coming back. You can sell your capabilities to these language models using monetization. So I'm taking this as very positive. As well as a product company, we are keeping a close eye on what's really happening, and then trying to integrate those capabilities to the product stack. So one example, I would say, we were speaking about citizen integration for a long time, how a business user can build an integration with the UI. But why you use a UI, now you can tell the AI engine to build the integration for you. We can easily integrate it into the product stack. So that is how we are planning to utilize some of these trends happening. But coming from the first principles, we will carefully watch and then bring the necessary stuff into the product stack without getting too much excited about things happening around.
Yeah, well, this is probably a conversation that we need to continue on that topic when WSO2 figures out, okay, what makes sense for our customers, right?
Exactly.
And so, yeah, let's hold that one put a bookmark there.
Great.
As always, it's a real pleasure to have a conversation with you, Asanka. And I know people are going to enjoy this broad range of architecture, DDD, and then how to implement, how to deploy and run. So thank you very much.
Likewise, Vaughn, thank for inviting me, as well as it was a great conversation, and looking forward to more conversations like this in the future.